in the Republican Party, clear enough for people to see, and start re-energizing the Democratic base that's been pretty much lost for a generation.
The Senate has a grave duty to insist on a full debate that examines for all Americans the full range of options before us and weighs those options together with their risks and costs.
And after he got done speaking, he come over to me, or come down, and he said, "Pat O'Reilly, my friend." And he gave me a big hug, because he's a wrestler. Each time he'd give you a hug, he'd just kind of take your breath away. He'd squeeze you so tight. But that was his way of being nice to people.
How is it that the main voice of opposition just vanished, just disappeared, just suddenly kind of like dropped out of the sky and died for no reason, and there never, ever, ever was a comprehensive investigation, and the political destiny of the country changed?
He would have called for a vigorous investigation of 9/11. He was opposed to cover-ups. He wanted transparency in government. He believed in democracy. He was the most aggressive, consistent, reliable critic of the Bush administration during the history of its existence.
He had Halliburton in court, and that he was standing against the multi-billion-dollar profits of the Iraq war machine.
He certainly wouldn't have been in the pockets of the pharmaceuticals and people that are running the country.
And Wellstone, if you look at where he comes from, he was the most politically progressive member of the U.S. Senate, yet he came from a swing state that goes either way, Democrat, Republican.
The re-election of Paul Wellstone, when the anti-labor groups threw everything, with the pharmaceutical companies, the oil companies, the big HMOs, when they threw everything they could at him, when we would have won that, and we would have won that election.
It was only 10 days before the election. Paul Wellstone had been pulling ahead. He was 6 or 7 points ahead of Norman Coleman, the former mayor of St. Paul, who was the hand-picked candidate of the Bush administration.
The calls were made from Washington. George Bush, Dick Cheney, Karl Rove decided that Coleman was going to be the candidate to run against him.
With the loss of Paul Wellstone, a lot of people feel the Democrats lost what could have been the most vibrant presidential candidate, somebody who could have clearly articulated a difference.
There have been questions raised about the consequences of our actions here at home. Of greatest and of gravest concern, obviously, are the questions raised about the possible loss of life that could result from our actions. The United States could post tens of thousands of troops in Iraq, and in so doing, we risk countless lives of United States soldiers and innocent Iraqis.
It was a major, political earthquake, and it happened, it happened with a mysterious small plane crash.
For us to lose Senator Paul Wellstone as a leader and as a person is devastating. But for us to lose Sheila, Marcia, his dedicated staff, and 2 pilots makes our already heavy hearts even sadder.
10 days later, when the plane crashed and they said Wellstone was killed, I immediately felt sorrow for all the people in the whole United States and the world, because here's the one man that had the compassion and the heart. I knew they killed him.
On March 10, 2009, at the University of Minnesota Great Conversations event, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, in response to a question from University of Minnesota political scientist Larry Jacobs, spoke of an ongoing covert domestic military operation that he called an executive assassination ring.
Things happen. And do they continue to happen to this day?
Yep. After 9/11, I haven't written about this yet, but the Central Intelligence Agency was very deeply involved in domestic activities against people they thought to be enemies of the state without any legal authority for it. They haven't been called on it yet. That does happen. Right now, today, there was a story in the New York Times that, if you read carefully, mentioned something known as the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC it's called, is a special wing of our special operations community that is set up independently. They do not report to anybody except in the Bush-Cheney days, they reported directly to the Cheney office. They do not report to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or to Mr. Gates, the Secretary of Defense. They report directly to him. Congress has no oversight of it. It's an executive assassination wing, essentially. And it's been going on and on and on.
Dick Cheney personally warned him that if he opposed the administration, there would be severe ramifications for him and for the state of Minnesota.
He said, "Paul, how was your week?" And he said, "My week was tough. The Vice President Cheney called me in and told me get on their bandwagon or there'd be serious ramifications in Minnesota." And he said there is a lot of things that just don't add up.
And just today in the Times, there was a story saying that its leader, a three-star admiral named McRaven, ordered a stop to certain activities because there were so many collateral deaths. There were so many collateral deaths.
We were having a convention in the fall conference 10 days prior to Wellstone being killed. The guest speaker was Paul Wellstone. When he got done speaking, there were 350 veterans at the convention, all stood up and gave him a standing ovation. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a very good speech. Paul went and shook every single person's hand there and gave them each 2 or 3 minutes. He was there for over an hour and a half. He came down and I asked him how his week had been, and he said his week had been tough. The Vice President Cheney called me in and told me get on their bandwagon or there'd be serious ramifications in Minnesota. And to stop sticking my nose into the 9/11, when he made the statement to us about Dick Cheney calling him in, there were about 10 veterans standing around with us. He knew then at Wilmer that the 9/11 was staged. I believe that Wellstone was after 9/11. He spoke about the 9/11 to the veterans. And then when I spoke with him